He does plenty of articles on antiwar.com. He writes articles for the Mises Institute. And I would like to have us give him a warm welcome and to give us a speech today.
Hello. First, thank you all for having me here tonight. Thanks especially to Joshua for having initially reached out to me and for working to help make this happen. I'm here tonight to talk to you mainly about foreign policy because I think it is a singularly winning issue for libertarians. I'll explain why I think this is, but first I want to explain why I think that it is important even at the state level. Because it isn't always obvious how much foreign policy impacts the lives of Americans every single day. But the fact is, at current levels of military spending, over $1 trillion annually once veterans carrying maintenance of the nuclear stockpile are taken into account, cutting that number in half would mean a return to U.S. households of thousands of dollars annually. So the question naturally is, would cutting military spending in this way make us unsafe? Far from it. As the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff admitted in a Senate committee hearing just a few years ago, the country could be defended for approximately a tenth of the current budget, or $100 billion. That would represent a return to households of over $7,000 annually. Only the Libertarian Party supports this policy of spending just what we need to defend the country and giving the rest back to the American people, whose money it really is. After all, it isn't as though the money has been spent, is being spent, or is likely to be spent in the future at all well. Again, far from it. Since the first Cold War ended, Republicans and Democrats have together sought to maintain a global military presence, purportedly to keep us safe and to further American interests. And even when they weren't paying particularly close attention, the national security and military establishments have logics all their own, and the policies continued. In summary, intervention followed intervention followed intervention. But whatever else they or their loyal corporate media allies and think tank propagandists would have you believe, the facts are these. When the first Cold War ended, the U.S. was on relatively good terms with Moscow and Beijing, its only two potential pure competitors and therefore the most important relationships Washington should have been focused on maintaining. The country was involved in no active military operations. Islamic terrorism was confined to several hundred fighters operating out of a handful of Middle East states, with the Middle East itself otherwise fairly stable. The country was reducing its nuclear arsenal, as was Russia. The Israelis and Palestinians seemed close to a deal, and domestically, the economy was in good shape, and the national debt a very manageable $3 trillion. By contrast, today, when one looks around, they find relations between Washington and both Moscow and Beijing are at their multi-decade worst. The U.S. is party to active military operations in multiple areas, including the previously unthinkable, a major war in Europe. The Middle East has been smashed to pieces and will likely remain a disaster zone for decades. Islamic terrorism has spread, with multiple organizations in multiple countries on multiple continents with tens of thousands of fighters. Several countries, including North Korea, have acquired nuclear weapons, and the U.S. economy faces a likely recession after just 2 years of expansion, while the debt stands at a politically and economically unpayable $30 trillion. And that's just an acknowledged debt, not an outstanding unfunded liabilities. Given the enormity of the human, economic, social, political, and geopolitical costs imposed by their joint policies, from the invasions of Serbia and Iraq to the toppling of governments in Ukraine and Libya, the entire war on terror from Somalia to Afghanistan to the United States itself, to the renewal of Cold War conflict with Russia and China and nuclear proliferation, it seems fair to judge them an abysmal and oftentimes criminal failure. They've cost a fortune in lives and money. They've cost the United States respect on the world stage. They've made us less safe and less free. Even so, as things currently stand, these trends look likely to continue. And this is why foreign policy is an especially winning issue for libertarians. As longtime outsiders, we had nothing to do with the implementation of the disastrous policies our government has pursued since the end of the first Cold War. And in order to win these arguments, all we have to do is tell the truth. As the political scientist Stephen Walt, among others, has pointed out, when polled, Americans actually prefer a much more restrained foreign policy than their so-called elites. This might explain why our government has had to repeatedly lie and mislead the American public in order to get them to go along. Realistically speaking, one has to admit it has generally worked. Libertarians need, collectively therefore, to be well versed in these issues. Vital work is published daily at libertarian think tanks and outlets such as the Ludwig von Mises, Libertarian and Cato Institutes, as well as antiwar.com. The writers at these outlets make it their mission to inform the reader, summarizing opaque and interconnected information about distant conflicts and polities into digestible chunks. It is critical that politically active libertarians engaging in public discourse, whether online or in person, be able to hold their own effectively against the predictable onslaught of naysayers parroting whatever they heard from CNN, Fox, or the government itself. As my wife is fond of saying, a person is smart, but people are dumb. On an individual level, when faced with obvious questions like, how do 700 military bases in over 70 countries around the world make us here in the United States safer and richer? Or why, after fighting a 20-year war against radical Islamic terrorism, are there more terrorists than when we started? Most politically active people, Republican and Democrat, young, old, and in between, are suddenly very perplexed. Something clearly isn't right. That much they will at least admit. The truth is, at the end of Cold War I, Americans faced no external threats. Further, these bases have cost a fortune, served as potent sources of anti-Americanism, magnets for terrorism, conflict with rival great powers, and have in no demonstrable way kept Americans in the United States safer or made them more prosperous. Libertarians looking to hook a potential convert might try a favorite question of mine. Would you rather have the foreign policy disasters of the last 20 years, from Iraq and Afghanistan to Libya, Syria, Somalia, Yemen, Georgia, and now Ukraine, or would you rather each U.S. household had $140,000? The results are unsurprisingly uniform. Arguably, the biggest problem then is that Washington's policies, supported by the Republicans and Democrats, are not presented as this choice to voters, not by their representatives or by each party's loyal corporate mouthpieces and influencers. It falls, therefore, to the Libertarian Party to stop the madness. This madness is a paradigmatic worldview, and it has a name: liberal hegemony. Its advocates, the neoconservatives and liberal internationalists, believe that by exerting its military and economic might, the United States can and should transform the entire world into a docile collection of prosperous liberal capitalist democracies, as this is the only way the United States' own maximal security can be assured. From economic sanctions to the toppling of governments in supposedly unfriendly countries, from expanding military alliances and commitments to direct military interventions, free trade agreements, global institution building, and global wealth redistribution. Together, successive administrations, starting with the George H.W. Bush, started and tried every tactic to realize liberal hegemony and the end of history. It was social engineering on a global scale, and when you know it, they failed. And now the so-called unipolar moment is over. The moment when Washington was at its arguably most relatively powerful position ever, and certainly its strongest since the end of the Second World War, and the Republican and Democratic foreign policy establishment decided to try and remake the world in America's image. Whether or not a key decision here or there could have changed everything is a pointless counterfactual, perhaps of interest to historians, but as far as public policy is concerned, the obvious lessons to be drawn are those stemming from what actually happened in the given instances. Instead, obvious failures are spun as wins or at least solid draws by the very architects of the failures themselves. And even more than that, despite having gotten it wrong time and again, these same people are constantly back to tell us what we should do now that the latest intervention they authored or cheered has failed. Really, the results have been so uniformly negative that even the most rabid of the interventionist former cheerleaders, such as the neoconservative Robert Kagan, husband of Obama and Biden administration State Department ranking member Victoria Nuland, have been somewhat sobered by the last 20 years of failure. But don't give them too much credit. After all, they're not back with a mea culpa, no apologies, but instead with more ideas. And when you know it, they're even more disastrous than their originals. Because where before the Hawks had us dropping millions of tons of bombs on all but defenseless people in Africa and the Middle East, they've been hard at work for years now, picking a multi-front conflict with Russia and China. Were it not so serious, one might find it somewhat amusing to consider that from the Hawks' own perspective, their new strategy actually represents a scaling back of their ambitions. But indeed it does, at least conceptually. The primary difference is that the old strategy sought to integrate all states into the global order and institutions created by the United States during the post-World War II period, with the goal of gradually transforming all countries into liberal capitalist democracies. A few minor recalcitrant states might need to be militarily compelled, but otherwise the arc of history, as Barack Obama as late as 2011 put it, was obvious. With America having won the Cold War, there were no longer any viable alternatives to liberal capitalist democracy. Now, history obviously not having ended, strong resistance to liberal hegemony having been encountered by key states, i.e. Russia and China, Washington is switching to a more conventional strategy. The goal is now to preserve the post-Cold War I gains in Europe, Asia, and Africa by a policy of neo-containment aimed at Russia and China, with the underlying goal of maintaining hegemony in the Western Hemisphere while denying regional hegemony to either of its rivals. In plain speech, what this basically boils down to is that neither of these countries, China or Russia, whose governments are not in line with what Washington orthodoxy and official policy prescribe, do not want to feel threatened by a U.S. military presence in their immediate vicinity. For all the scaremongering about world domination, apart from recognition of their legitimate interest by Washington and a commitment to non-interference in their domestic affairs, that is all Moscow or Beijing have ever said they want. America should have had and should be working towards a strategy that reflects this reality, not the worst nightmares of Pentagon planners or the op-ed pages of the New York Times or Foreign Affairs. The latter of which is one of a whole host of publications and institutions solely devoted to discovering new problems that they tell us supposedly need America's immediate attention. Of course, it should be noted that when they aren't being funded by the government itself, like the Atlantic Council or Council on Foreign Relations, they are funded by corporations like General Dynamics and Lockheed Martin, companies with obvious interests in the established policies being continued. And this is to say nothing of the influence of foreign money and lobbying on U.S. foreign policy, though that too is a pervasive and well-documented problem. But instead of the foreign policy suitable to our geography and relative preponderance of economic, military, and demographic strength, the Hawks' new strategy of confrontation everywhere and at every point with Moscow and Beijing threatens the destruction of the entire human race and over places most Americans on an ordinary day couldn't point to on a map or tell you anything about. And why should they? On their worst day, most Americans are better off than 99.9% of people who have ever existed. And we would be better off still if our government stopped trying to play at indispensability and acting as arbiter of right and wrong around the globe. The new Cold War, and we are in a new Cold War, already encompasses everything, over conflicts from the future directions of nations, as in Ukraine and Taiwan, to the blocking of adoptions and student exchanges. It increasingly dominates economic relations, from sanctions, tariffs, and trade frameworks, all the way down to Washington working behind the scenes to prompt the revision of the United Kingdom, of the prior sale of a small domestic microchip maker to a Dutch-based Chinese firm on the grounds of national security. This when, per the Wall Street Journal, the chips mostly go in hair dryers and dishwashers. Not that the Wall Street Journal or any mainstream publication, news outlet, or think tank objects to such violations of international norms and trade laws. Far from it. The entire deal is cast ominously, one of a string of front-page teasers about new Chinese threats, from aircraft carriers. They basically have two, and they aren't anything special or anywhere near as good as our own dozen nuclear-powered supercarriers, to Hong Kong, which is part of China. The journalism alone, of course, the Economist regularly devotes whole sections to the fake China threat, most recently about its ominous behavior in Africa, which behind the hyperbole, bombast, and regular characterization of hypothetical worst-case scenarios as near certainties, amounts to little more than infrastructure and relationship building, all of which is welcomed by the governments and peoples of the countries in question, as the authors admit in a typical end-of-the-paragraph throwaway line. So just to review, the Hawks' previous plan, which was flawed, hubristic, and foolish to begin with, got us trillions of dollars in debt, cost millions of American manufacturing jobs, started a new arms race, blew up the Middle East, led to multiple wars between Russia and its neighbors, resulted in the deaths or displacement of millions of people, and all in all, did not work, thus necessitating the need for their new plan of a new Cold War with Russia and China. Naturally, all their schemes having failed, they encourage and expect Americans to feel more afraid than ever. But again, we face no dangers abroad other than those they made for us. Their plans far exceed what is necessary for American safety. In fact, as will be clearly demonstrated, the current trajectory of U.S. foreign policy makes us, as well as the rest of the world, increasingly unsafe and unfree, and much more. But our government refuses to listen or to grapple with any of this, i.e. reality. And now we have reached a crisis more dangerous than Cuba 60 years ago. Who is to blame? It would be impossible to explain in its entirety how we got to this moment in just 45 minutes. And given practical restraints and a couple of other topics I'd like to conclude by touching on, I'm going to tell you a story. In it, I'm going to take you from the threat environment the United States faced at the end of the First Cold War to that of the present day by describing a series of important and interconnected events. While by no means complete, the events I'm going to highlight will sketch out the real arc of history, the one that led us to the multi-front disasters of today and the looming disasters of tomorrow. If you take nothing else from my remarks, make it this: our government is primarily responsible for practically all of them. They had a chance to bring American forces home, for all of us to live in freedom and prosperity for generations. Instead, they tried to rule the world, and we are now faced with reliving the worst experiences of our parents and grandparents during the First Cold War, along with all the other problems the Republicans, Democrats, and national security establishment helped create along the way. Let me tell you about them. The end of the Cold War. Facing a tanking economy and an angsty electorate, in 1991, the incumbent George H.W. Bush said something surprising: "We won the Cold War." It was something neither he nor his predecessor Ronald Reagan had ever said, despite the latter having surprisingly overseen the conclusion of the arms race and global contest for influence between the two. In fact, what Bush said in the hopes of generating electoral returns violated the spirit of the agreement that had brought the First Cold War to a close, that there were no winners and no losers. Instead, the unlikely pairing of the ardent Cold Warrior Reagan and the reformist Gorbachev called the whole crazy thing off. It had sprung from a climate of mutual mistrust and fear, with the backdrop of mushroom clouds and the most devastating war humankind will ever live through. And it had carried on through efforts at détente in each decade of the Cold War period. What had changed? Why did Bush spike the football, contrary to his own and Reagan's promises to the Soviets? Apart from wanting to generate support in the run-up to a close and rare three-way race for the White House in 1992, something very important had occurred. The Soviet Union had ceased to exist. There were multiple reasons for this, but how Boris Yeltsin and company were able to pull off its ultimate destruction is actually fairly simple. Recognizing that he was the most popular politician in Russia, destroying the Soviet Union and making all its member states independent would leave him the head of Russia, and his mostly communist and former Communist Party accomplices, the heads of their respective states in Central and Eastern Europe as well. Thus, in a secret meeting with his co-conspirators, Yeltsin dissolved the Soviet Union, thus rendering Gorbachev the head of a thing that no longer existed. Actually, the first Bush administration handled the sudden breakup of the Soviet Union well enough. The real trouble with Russia started under Bill Clinton, but we'll get to that. Loose nukes were secured, Soviet troops peacefully withdrawn from Eastern Europe, and Baker's not 1 inch promise circumvented by a legalistic addendum to the 2+4 agreement that reunified Germany and brought it into NATO. For now, the US stood apparently alone. Russia was a wrecked shell of the former Soviet Union, and China was still struggling to rise up the ranks of the emerging economies. Was it time to go home? The unipolar moment. No. This situation would not maintain itself, the hawks argued. Serious complications to American interests could arrive anywhere at any time, necessitating a comprehensive and immediate response, whatever they thought was required. As it happened, just such an apparent event erupted at that exact moment. Perhaps discussions of the direction of U.S. foreign policy in the 1990s would have been different, but for Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait and subsequent eviction by U.S. and allied forces. Codenamed Desert Storm, the short ensuing war did more than any other to rehabilitate the reputation of the U.S. military after Vietnam in the eyes of the U.S. public and the world. The U.S. military made it look easy, mercilessly barraging Saddam's forces with distant naval armaments and aerial bombardments before steamrolling the few that hadn't retreated all the way back to the Iraqi border. The combat phase of the operation lasted just weeks, and the U.S. forces deployed were all, or almost all, withdrawn. And that point is key. We'll come back to it. But even as I described the smashing victory of American arms, it should be noted that Saddam's invasion had been apparently invited by the first Bush administration, or at least not warned off. Occupied by the breakup of the Soviet Union, numerous complaints from Saddam about Kuwaiti slant drilling of Iraqi oil fields over unpaid war debts from fighting Iran, with covert U.S. help, went unanswered before a distracted Bush directed his ambassador to communicate to Saddam that the U.S., quote, took no sides in disputes between Arabs. Whether or not this was all just a trap to ensnare a formerly useful but now annoying U.S. asset, like the then recently ousted Manuel Noriega in Panama, or whether a busy Bush and his team simply hadn't thought it through, the response was immediate and furious. The Saudis in particular couldn't believe that after years of loyal service, over-pumping oil and defying U.S. debt, that the U.S. would unchain the Iraqi dictator, who was known to use chemical weapons on his own people, as well as on the Iranians during the war. Whatever the case actually was, Saddam's invasion couldn't be allowed to stand, it was said. It was bigger than one conflict. It was about upholding a, quote, rules-based international order, where the rule of law, quote, supplanted the rule of the jungle. Someone should have told his successors, then maybe, just maybe, things would have been different. Because if there was one thing that defined the so-called unipolar moment, it was our American government's refusal to acknowledge any limitations on itself or its actions. Rules, in short, were what Washington would make and others would follow. NATO, expansion, and going out of area. It is counterfactual and unfounded to imagine that the policies pursued by the Clinton administration after the former Arkansas governor surprisingly took office in 1992 were markedly different than those a second H.W. Bush administration would have pursued. Disastrous though they were, from the expansion of NATO to the sanctions on Iraq, the continued utilization of useful Islamic terrorist groups to intervening in Bosnia and Serbia, the first Bush administration had been crammed with neocons and old Cold Warriors. Those who Bush's national security advisor, the General Brent Scowcroft, called, quote, the crazies in the basement, and who later took prominent positions in George W. Bush's administration. They would have pushed for the same policies, if not even worse ones. Maybe we would have actually attacked North Korea. Probably we would have had a war with Iran, who, like Cuba, can't shake the inveterate hatred of the U.S. establishment that comes from having overthrown one of its guys, no matter how much of an evil despot he had been. Worth noting, too, is that though the elder Bush was by nature and experience averse to bold action, had in fact worked late to try and help hold the crumbling Soviet Union together for fear of the consequences of its collapse, it was the senior Bush who had insisted on the door to NATO not being subject to closure by anyone other than Washington. While it was true that, technically speaking, NATO expansion was not precluded by the 2+4 agreement that reunited Germany and brought it into the Western Alliance, again, it was the spirit of the accord that was subsequently violated by Washington. But it was not violated in the name of furthering the safety and prosperity of the American people. Rather, powerful domestic corporate and political interests pushed for an expansion of the U.S. global role rather than any retrenchment or reimagining. And this was particularly true of the lobby to expand NATO. So it was that even as the usually pliant Boris Yeltsin, whom Clinton had helped get reelected in 1996 by really interfering in a Russian election, complained about the first round of NATO enlargement, Lockheed Martin Vice President Bruce Jackson was handing out money to members of Congress to ensure the governments of those countries petitioning to join the American Defensive Alliance were let in, which meant they had to buy all new American equipment from companies like, wouldn't you know it, Lockheed Martin. NATO expansion, in other words, was big business. More on NATO expansion later. For the time being, the existing alliance was about to do something truly unprecedented. For while the alliance had periodically expanded to take in new members since its founding in 1949, it had never undertaken an offensive combat operation, but that was about to change. NATO, which needed a mission to stay relevant and keep the billions flowing to the bureaucrats at alliance headquarters in Brussels, found one in the former Yugoslavia. Dubbing the Europeans' fumbling efforts to construct a new security architecture as weak and ineffectual, when a minor conflict in Bosnia erupted, Washington stepped in. It would be difficult to overstate the amount of alarm this first move out of area by NATO caused in Moscow and Beijing. After all, NATO had always been a defensive alliance, but the harm that intervention did was nothing compared to what would follow just a few years later in Serbia. There, the U.S. government took the side of the terrorist Kosovo Liberation Army, essentially a collection of Islamic radicals the U.S. had previously supported in their wars in Afghanistan and the Caucasus over that of Belgrade. Lacking any UN resolution to do so, the Russians watched in anger as the U.S. military intervened to pound the Serbs, Russia's only real ally in Europe, and detach the historic province of Kosovo unilaterally. This, not Putin's actions in Ukraine a decade and a half later, was the first time since the aftermath of World War II a major power had used force to unilaterally redraw borders in Europe. It also nearly led to a war between the United States and Russia, when commander of U.S. forces in Europe, General Wesley Clark, ordered NATO forces to attack Russian peacekeepers occupying the airport at Pristina, only to be disobeyed by the commanding officer on the ground, General Michael Jackson. Despite protestations from Moscow that the expansion of the now clearly offensive military alliance towards its borders into Central and Eastern European states formerly occupied by the Soviet Union, Washington ignored these complaints, instead opting for more expansion and more out-of-area, that is to say offensive, campaigns. Even so, despite what you've been led to believe, when he came to power in 2000 as Yeltsin's hand-picked successor, Putin's initial foreign policy was one of outreach to Washington for a potential partnership. More on this later, but suffice it to say, successive rounds of NATO expansion, including up to the literal borders of Russia, the attempted toppling of its allies in the region, and the unilateral abrogation of important nuclear arms control agreements by Washington quickly soured the relationship. 9/11 and the global war on terror. Speaking of making enemies, despite its apparent success, Operation Desert Storm was to create significant blowback down the road. Having first fostered radical jihadists in Afghanistan in order to bloody the Soviets in the 70s and 80s, one of these fighters eventually came to see the United States as the real enemy. After the U.S. left bases in Saudi Arabia following Iraq War I in order to continue to terrorize the country, as its sanctions killed an estimated 500,000 children. That according to the UN. Osama bin Laden turned against his former Washington benefactors. "Why is your blood blood, but our blood is water?" he demanded in a message explaining his motives for the most heinous attack on Americans in their history. Rather than taking a moment to reflect on how 20 years of bad policy, as well as numerous intelligence failures, had led to such a devastating blow to the country, the new George W. Bush administration had other ideas. Abroad, it invaded Afghanistan and Iraq. In the case of the former, we now know from Rumsfeld's own papers that the Taliban leadership quickly offered to surrender bin Laden and enter negotiations, but the offer was rebuffed and never made public to the American people until over a decade later, and then only thanks to repeated Freedom of Information Act requests. In Iraq, lies on top of lies convinced the American people of obvious canards. That Saddam, who had killed more radical Islamists than the US up to that point, which had been too busy funding them, was in cahoots with bin Laden. Further, despite vociferous objections from UN inspectors in Iraq, that Saddam was building weapons of mass destruction to give bin Laden. What a nightmare. Of course, the only problem was that none of this was true, which then Secretary of State Colin Powell eventually admitted, after himself lying to the UN in order to make the case for regime change in Baghdad. Not that they fooled anyone outside the American public. And just like in Serbia, the UN was ignored, allies left behind, and the war fought on the basis of virtually unilateral so-called US authority. Secret black site prisons filled with those unlucky enough to have been subjected to so-called extraordinary rendition, which was kidnapping by another name, the legitimation of torture, the erosion of our own civil liberties, and the doubling of the national debt in just 8 years to more than $10 trillion. The George W. Bush years were an unmitigated disaster, and Obama was no better. Having criticized both wars while he was briefly in the Senate, and having laughingly received the Nobel Peace Prize after just weeks in office, he proceeded to go back on his campaign promises to end the by then clearly feudal wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and bring our troops home. In fact, he doubled down. Not only that, Obama expanded U.S. military operations around the globe. Like Richard Nixon before him, he understood that what Americans objected to were not large numbers of deaths, only American deaths. By, quote, changing the color of the corpses, to use Nixon's phrase, he and his national security team effectively distanced the American people from what his government was doing, thus ushering in the era of forever wars. He expanded U.S. military involvement into Syria, Libya, in Somalia, Yemen, and elsewhere, often using small numbers of U.S. special forces and drones to eliminate those who were unlucky enough to be assigned to one of the White House's weekly kill lists. Read it in any mainstream corporate outlet. When he sent U.S. forces back into Iraq following the scheduled 2011 withdrawal, it was to fight the same Sunni extremists funded by the Saudis, and in some cases backed by the U.S. intelligence services, the so-called moderate rebels, but which were really Al-Qaeda by another name, and what would eventually become ISIS. Spying on allies, killing large numbers of civilians with allegedly precision missile strikes, lying about all of it, and meanwhile prosecuting with an unrivaled zeal the heroic whistleblowers and leakers who dared expose the magnitude of our government's crimes. I could go on, but for the sake of time, it suffices to say that Obama and then Trump doubled and then tripled down on virtually all the military conflicts they inherited in the Middle East and Africa, as well as waded into a few more. Aimed at encircling longtime boogeyman Iran, as the former General Wesley Clark admitted, they all failed. They even failed at failing, with the on-paper only Afghan army revealed to be a $1 trillion farce the instant U.S. forces departed the country in the fall of 2021 after 20 years, leaving the Taliban back in control of Kabul, a result that had been all but guaranteed no later than 2006. But just as they were tiring of the proverbial sandbox and the insane and immoral mess they had made, trouble struck Europe. Or rather they, our foreign policy and national security establishment, made trouble in Europe. Georgia, Ukraine, and the new Cold War. As the single most important geopolitical event in the world today, I am not going to try and cram a summary of the history leading up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine into what little time I have left. For those who desire a comprehensive and easily digestible lecture on the topic, the Libertarian Institute's director, the great Scott Horton, gave a speech a few months ago at a Libertarian Party event in Utah, which you can easily find on YouTube. For those especially interested in the contested events of 2014, the so-called Revolution of Dignity, Antiwar.com's managing editor Kyle Ancelone gave an equally excellent and important speech on the topic shortly after Scott's talk. And when the video of this goes up, I will ask Joshua to please insert links to those. I would ask that you listen and share them as widely as possible. Because while what they say and what I have said so far falls outside the bounds of what Noam Chomsky has long referred to as polite conversation, that is, it makes people uncomfortable, it is nonetheless true. The truth is often uncomfortable, but it is no less necessary for that. And given the present state, the possible annihilation of the entire human race, it is in fact the responsibility of those in a position to do so to speak out against these policies, whatever the consequences. And the truth, however uncomfortable, is this. After supporting an attempt to overturn the results of the 2004 election in Ukraine, in 2007, the George W. Bush administration pressed for NATO membership action plans for Ukraine and Georgia. Berlin and Paris, unwilling to take such a provocative and unnecessary step, were finally bullied into acceding to a joint statement that said, in effect, yeah, eventually at some point Georgia and Ukraine will someday, yeah, probably join the alliance. But for Putin, this was a bridge too far. As I already said, Putin entered office seeking partnership with Washington, even asking whether Russia could join NATO. Despite knowing the Clinton administration had been secretly sponsoring the Chechen terrorists of the Mujahideen's fight against the Soviets in Afghanistan in their own fight against Moscow and the Caucasus, the events of 9/11 led Putin to incorrectly believe that a partnership in the name of fighting Islamic terrorism with Washington was now possible. Putin was the first leader to call Bush in the wake of the attack on 9/11, and at considerable political risk to himself from domestic hardliners, Putin offered Bush his complete cooperation. He provided intelligence and permission for the U.S. to stage operation and bases all along Russia's soft underbelly. In return, Bush quickly betrayed him, unilaterally ripping up the Intermediate Range Arms Control Agreement negotiated by Reagan and Gorbachev and sponsoring the so-called Big Bang expansion of NATO, taking in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. We might ask how the inclusion of a country like tiny Lithuania improved Americans' own security and prospects for prosperity, but that would be silly, since who pays and who benefits is obvious. Again, though the Russians objected, they were still effectively too weak to do anything to prevent it, though that was all soon to change. The commodity super cycle of the 2000s brought money pouring into Russia's coffers, and Putin immediately set about rebuilding Russia's conventional military capabilities in order to defend its legitimate security interests, which it rightly felt were increasingly under threat. Attempts at regime change in Russia's, quote, near abroad, the so-called color revolutions, which were endorsed by Washington and often directly backed by them, increased the sense of urgency. As I already said, the final straw came in 2007 when Washington signaled its intention to move its military assets into Ukraine and Georgia, the latter a tiny country in the Caucasus between the Black and Caspian Seas. There, its president, the Western-leaning Saakashvili, was encouraged by Washington to resolve its outstanding border disputes with the breakaway enclaves of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Wrongly assuming Washington's full backing, he impetuously ordered an invasion of the province, killing the Russian peacekeepers there in the process. Predictably, the Russians responded by invading and humiliating the Georgians. Shockingly, in his own memoirs, George W. Bush admits that then Vice President Dick Cheney was for bombing the Russians as they tried to enter Georgia, effectively sparking World War III and almost certain nuclear annihilation over a country no more than 1% of Americans could even point to a map, let alone tell you anything about, because it is not at all important to our security or interests. After the disaster of the Russo-Georgian War, Washington and Brussels decided to try a different tactic to integrate the much larger, more important, and historically Russian province of the Ukraine, geoeconomics. Now, I don't know what you know about the 2014 so-called Revolution of Dignity, but it was an all but complete sham. A gay pride parade, seriously, I'm not joking, was hijacked by ultra-nationalists like Svoboda, C14, and Right Sector, openly neo-Nazi groups. Using the pretense of the democratically elected Ukrainian president Viktor Yanukovych's rejection of an outrageous EU association agreement, which was really an ultimatum that tried to force Yanukovych to cut all ties with Russia and submit to, quote, joint European security policy, NATO without mentioning NATO, these literally fascist ultranationalist forces, with open and covert support by the United States, violently overthrew the government. while the French and German leaders, Francois Hollande and Angela Merkel, hesitated to endorse what Stratford's George Freeman has called, quote, the most blatant coup in history, the U.S. forced the violent change in government to stick, which we know, thanks to the leaked phone call between Obama's Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, Victoria Nuland, and the U.S. Ambassador in Kiev, Jeffrey Pyatt, where they discussed their choices for the new government, which was created and recognized by Washington shortly thereafter. After threats to immediately evict the Russians from their only year-round warm water port, on lease from the Ukrainian government in Crimea, Putin ordered the troops stationed there to leave their base and secure the historically Russian province it had lost over 250,000 men defending from the Nazis and their Romanian and Ukrainian collaborators during the Second World War. At the same time, the ethnically Russian-dominated provinces in the east of Ukraine rebelled against the new coup government, and over the next 7 years would face constant attack. According to the UN, of the over 14,000 people killed in the Donbass during that period, the overwhelming majority were ethnically Russian Ukrainians killed by the government in Kiev, and Russia only intervened when it looked like Kiev would succeed in destroying them all. It should be clear from all of this that Russia was responding to events, not precipitating them. Even so, Moscow only ever helped to prevent the destruction of the autonomous zones that had refused to accept the unconstitutional transfer of power in 2014, which was followed by attempts to marginalize the Russian language and culture, as well as rehabilitate and turn into national heroes, Nazi collaborators like Stepan Bandera. For their part, the French and Germans just wanted this madness to stop, and in a series of diplomatic efforts tried to resolve the conflict as best they could. The Minsk agreements, which are now dead, sought to preserve a whole and neutral Ukraine, granting significant regional autonomy to the Russian-speaking eastern portions of the country in exchange for laying down their arms. But Washington let it be known to their ultranationalist allies, who we now know the CIA was covertly working to train, that they need not accede to these totally reasonable conditions. So instead, they held out, threatening each of the following Ukrainian leaders, including Zelensky, who actually ran on a peace platform of implementing the Minsk agreements if any of them dared to cut such a deal with Moscow. This while domestic and foreign lobbyists worked assiduously in D.C. to pressure successive administrations to start sending the heavy arms that Trump eventually did to groups like the, until recently openly neo-Nazi, Azov Battalion, who did the bulk of the fighting, the Ukrainian army at that time being a weak and poorly organized mess. While all this was going on, Obama, then Trump, and then Biden dramatically increased U.S. military activities and capabilities in the region, including the deployment of dual-use missile launchers in Romania and Poland, which could be armed with nuclear-tipped missiles, a clear violation of the arms control agreements in place at the time, but which are also now dead. They also increased U.S. naval patrols and nuclear bomber flights right up to the Russian border, as well as held military exercises just miles from the Russian border, including exercises in Ukraine. Zelensky, having come to power with the intention of ending the pointless and horrible civil war, but finding himself hemmed in by hardliners backed by Washington, he saw no choice but to push all in, and he traveled to Washington in September of this past year to ask again about Ukraine joining NATO. And this was the final straw. With Russian forces amassed along Ukraine's northern and eastern borders, Putin demanded the Biden administration acknowledge Ukraine's neutrality, despite claiming that Washington had, quote, no intention of putting American or NATO forces in Ukraine. Biden refused to put his own declared policy on paper, and the war came. I want to be clear, none of this justifies Putin's invasion of Ukraine or the ongoing war, but it does make it understandable. The obvious culmination of decades of slights, betrayals, and provocations by our government toward a country we should always have sought to keep good relations with. And so the American people will be impoverished and threatened with the possibility of nuclear war while the global South starves, and all in the name of including a country that would in no way have increased the security of Americans in our military alliance, in which Ukraine was unlikely to ever be able to join anyway, due to its massive levels of corruption, serious national minority problems, and outstanding border disputes. They are not pleasant, and this brief summary is far from complete, but those are the fundamental facts. It gets worse. China. I don't have much time left, and anyone who wants to know more about the fake China threat can consult my published works and many interviews on the topic, which you can find via my website. But very briefly, the United States has been interfering in Chinese domestic affairs since the 1850s. That is not a mistake on my part, literally since the 1850s. More recently, the U.S. government backed the loser of the Chinese Civil War, Chiang Kai-shek's brutal, corrupt, but nominally Republican forces against Mao and his communist guerrillas. When the former were defeated in 1949 and driven out of mainland China, they eventually holed up on the island of Formosa, Taiwan. Successive U.S. administrations, from Truman all the way to Nixon, refused to recognize the legitimacy of the communist government in Beijing, effectively preventing the conclusion of the Chinese Civil War by defending the Taiwan Strait with American naval power in the name of preventing the spread of so-called international communism. But Nixon and his national security advisor Henry Kissinger recognized that the apparently monolithic Communist Front was in fact split sharply along nationalist lines, with the Chinese refusing to follow Moscow's directives by the late 1950s at the absolute latest. Nixon's secret trip to Beijing and the 3 communiques that followed formed the basis of the eventual normalization of relations and the recognition of the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy by Jimmy Carter in 1978. These communiques required the U.S. to break off diplomatic relations with Taiwan, eliminate its military treaty with Taipei, and agree not to station U.S. forces on the island, now officially recognized by Washington as well as the UN as part of China. Both Beijing and Washington were now committed to work with Taipei to bring about a peaceful reunification. More on that in just a minute. With the death of Mao and the ensuing struggle for power having been won by the reformer Deng Xiaoping, China gradually opened up to foreign trade and investment and began to experiment with markets, prices, and private ownership. So began the most incredible period of economic development the world has ever witnessed, with 1 billion Chinese raised from the lowest levels of poverty to the position of an industrialized and comfortably middle-income society in just 30 years. With the end of the Cold War and the disintegration of the Soviet Union a few years later, the logic of Nixon and Kissinger's strategy of using China to balance the Soviet Union no longer held. U.S. policymakers had a new idea, however. Integrating China into the U.S.-created and dominated global institutional order would make it a, quote, responsible stakeholder. And with time, as the country grew wealthier and more integrated, would lead to the liberalization and democratization of China. This did not happen. Instead, granting China most favored nation trading status and allowing it into the WTO, despite it never really following the rules, resulted in the loss of millions of American manufacturing jobs. At the same time, it granted the communists in Beijing legitimacy at home as a provider of material well-being. Taiwan, meanwhile, had undergone democratization in the 1980s, and as the 1990s turned into the 2000s, the island nation began developing a strongly independent political movement, one that fundamentally rejected the basis of U.S.-Beijing normalization, its eventual reunification with the mainland. To be clear, the history is complicated, and the island hasn't really been effectively ruled by Beijing in over a century. The facts remain. Taiwan is not a country, not according to the UN, and not according to the official U.S. government line. As China's economic power increased, so too did its military capabilities. And rather than focusing on aircraft carriers and other power projection capabilities, PLA planners instead focused on building up an area denial capability strategy sufficient to deter any potential intervention by the United States in the event of a war between Taipei and Beijing, which Beijing has always said will come if Taipei ever declares its independence. According to Lyle Goldstein at the Naval War College, Beijing now has that capability. To recap, the United States government has been interfering in Chinese domestic affairs for almost 200 years. China, suffering successive defeats at the hands of the European and the Japanese empires, was in no position to prevent this. But this is no longer the case. And Washington's strategy of making China rich in the hopes of pushing its evolution into a liberal capitalist democracy having failed, the Democrats and Republicans now demand we confront the Chinese, and if necessary, fight them over territory that is literally part of China, Taiwan. That is essentially the situation. As if it weren't bad enough, the hawks are now demanding we confront China everywhere and on every issue, from infrastructure building in Africa to islands in the South and East China Seas, to trade and investment and attempts by the Chinese to build alternate institutions to the ones Washington effectively controls. The hysterical hawks tell us this is all to prevent Chinese world domination, but they are either lying to themselves or lying to you. The fake China threat is nothing more than the product of their overactive imaginations or a cynical, self-serving attempt to keep the $1 trillion-a-year war industry running. After all, their jobs depend on it, and if they admit we had faced no serious threats to our interests, they'll have to get real jobs, and we won't need to spend so much. For all the alarmism, all China has ever demanded is that Washington respect its core interest, which amounts to little more than observing Chinese sovereignty. In truth, the country is still poor compared to the United States by any number of measures. It faces serious economic, demographic, ethnic, and political headwinds, to say nothing of its awful geography, paucity of vital natural resources, and daunting security environment. Encircled as it is by numerous industrialized and populous states desirous of coming together to balance China, the U.S. need not take an active role in such efforts. In fact, its newfound alarmism and belligerence is making the situation worse, not better. What will happen is anyone's guess, but the Taiwan issue looms ever larger. Since the end of the First Cold War, the three communiques have been largely eroded by Washington, which regularly hosts high-level diplomatic contacts with Taiwan, including a $1 billion facility in Taipei itself, and now has U.S. troops stationed on the island. Even granting the strategic value of Taiwan, U.S. posturing is increasingly insane and at odds with our previous policies, with our government all but signing us up to fight a war with Beijing over part of China. In just the last year, Joe Biden has said repeatedly that the U.S. would militarily intervene to prevent the conclusion of the Chinese Civil War by force. Though Jake Sullivan and company have tried to walk the statement back afterwards, at some point such attempts just simply look ridiculous. This is madness, but it's also U.S. foreign policy. Why libertarianism matters. While there are splits within the libertarian movement, ideological and policy differences, at its most basic, libertarians believe the path to prosperity lies in human freedom. It rests on a belief that individuals should be free to make their own choices about what is best for them. From a normative standpoint, one might argue that it would be ideal for all people to enjoy such freedom and prosperity. But realistically, as a matter of policy, the cost of imposing such a situation on the entire world is simply too high and the task completely undoable. The prudence of our parents' and grandparents' generation was thrown out the window when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union later collapsed. Always ambitious, the Democratic and Republican foreign policy elites set out to remake the world in America's image. They failed, and they seem not to notice or care. It is up to the Libertarian Party to hold them to account and to get the American people to realize that these policies are not in their interests, that they make them poorer, less safe, and less free. Because of the overlap between various libertarian positions and those of other parties, such as decriminalizing drugs and cutting taxes, I have only one hard and fast rule for libertarians seeking public office. Never side with the hawks, because it is the only thing that makes us unquestionably different from the existing duopoly. Further, flatly reject any notion that refusing to go along with their insane plans constitutes a lack of patriotism on our part. The Republicans and Democrats are not the country. They are political parties who have destroyed the country, ripping up the Constitution in the process. Where, for example, in those hallowed pages does one find provision for the permanent deployment of U.S. troops in forever wars without congressional approval? Where the authority to set up a range of domestic and foreign spying apparatuses? I'll save you the time. The Republicans and Democrats did whatever they wanted. The Constitution be damned. As it was originally interpreted, the Constitution gave most power to the states, and it is towards this end we should work. At the state level, libertarians should be pragmatic in seeking effective coalitions to advance our interests. Know your audience. Don't tell democratic socialists and progressive you've just met how we're going to eliminate income and business taxes. Tell them how the Libertarian Party is the only party that actually seeks to end the war on drugs and release all nonviolent drug offenders immediately. When trying to sell such policies to conservatives, don't waste your breath talking about lower overdose rates and how it's just a plant, but instead focus on the enormous fiscal savings to be had. Remind them that it costs an average of over $30,000 per inmate per year. Though our policies are the correct ones, we should not kid ourselves. Being right isn't enough. This is politics, and every entrenched interest we attack will fight back. We need to be prepared. We need to network and support one another, communicate our policies clearly, stay on message, and work with other marginalized political groups to open up political competition within our individual states. Progressive leaders despise the centrists who dominate their party, in the same way the Trumpers hate the old guard Republicans. We should use this to our advantage. They are our natural allies, as they seek the same thing we do, the overthrow of the existing order. That order is based on liberal hegemony, a bankrupt idea that is bankrupting us. Thank you all for your time.